Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be doing factoring polynomials with greatest common factors with you. We are going to be doing the factoring as well as actually solving for the x-intercepts for today. So the question that we're going to start with is 8x cubed minus 16x squared is equal to 0. So what we need to do is we need to look for common factors, going to factor them out, and then that will make it easier for us to solve for the x-intercepts. Because when we look at this right now, we can't really solve with x-intercepts without using the quadratic formula, which won't work because guess what? This is a trinomial equation. So in order to solve, we do need to do some sort of factoring to get it in a form that we can use. So to start off, we need to look for greatest common factor. So if you watched my previous video that had greatest common factoring, you would know that we look at all the terms that are involved in the equation. So you will have term number 1 right here and term number 2 right here. Remember, what makes a term is any numbers or variables multiplied by each other, and then what splits up terms is an addition or subtraction. Okay, so that's how we divided term number 1 and term number 2. So when we are looking for greatest common factors, we need to break down what each one of these terms means so that we can find out what's similar about the things, right? So to start off, let's talk about the different factor options for the first term. So we have 8x to the power of 3, so 8x cubed. Let's talk about the factors of 8 first, and then we'll talk about how the 3 plays in this. Okay, so the factors of 8 are 1 and 8, because 1 times 8 is equal to 8. We have 2 and we have 4, and there are actually none others. Those are the 4 factors of 8. Okay, reminder, we have x cubed here. And what does that actually mean if you were to break it all down into factors? So these are all the factors that we have. I'm going to list them all here. What else do we have? We also have x's, right? We would have x's that would break down in here. But remember, these are technically all multiplied together as factors, right? 1 times 8 is equal to 8. So those are the two factors that make up 8. 2 times 4, same thing. They're the two factors that make up 8. But if we were going to break down x to the power of 3, what does that really mean, right? That actually means x times x times x. Okay? So we are going to have some sort of combination of this along with either this or this to make up 8x cubed, right? We always have to have the 3 x's because they're all cubed, but we don't know. Maybe we broke it down by 2 and 4, or we broke it down by 1 and 8. Both are options, okay? Let's look up the factors for the second term, which is 16x to the power of 2. Reminder, this is also negative, so we will have to look at that at some point as well. So what are the factors that make up 16? We'll do that one first. We have 1 and we have 16. What else do we have? We have 2 and we have 8. And then we also have 4 and 4. All of those things, when you multiply them together, they make 16. That's great. Now let's look back. Remember, we do have a negative sign here. So we know that there needs to be a negative somewhere on here. It can either be on the left or it can be on the right, but one of them has to be negative. One of them has to be negative. Doesn't matter which one at this point, but technically, if you were going to do that, you would have to pay attention to that negative sign. Okay, let's take a look at the x's now. Remember how we talked about that with the last one? This one is not x cubed, but it's actually x squared. So that means x times x, right? It's the same thing as x to the power of 2. Okay? So that means in order to make up negative 16x squared, you need to have any of these 3 options multiplied by each other, as well as this as well. The x times x also gets included in that. Okay? As well, something in here needs to be negative, right? Because we do need to get a negative symbol there. Okay? So these are all the factors that do exist for the second term. So now we've determined the factors of the first term. We've determined the factors of the second term. Now let's look for a greatest common factor, okay? Let's start by looking at the numbers, and then we'll deal with our x's in a moment, okay? So, for our numbers, what we're going to do is we are going to scan through. We're just going to scan through all of this, all of the numbers, and we're going to look for the greatest common one. So, I am going to look at this one. The largest number is 8 is here. Do we have 8 on the other side? Yes, we do. There's a 16 over here, but there's no 16 on this one. So we have 2 8s. So the 2 8s are the greatest common factor. So we can actually factor out an 8. So we're going to put our little symbol is going to go over here. We're going to put an 8 right here. This is where we're doing our factoring. We just don't know what our equation is going to be yet. So we're going to leave that. Okay, great. So we've determined we're taking out the 8. Now what can we do with the x's? Can we factor out any x's? Remember, we're looking for the greatest common. So, are there common x's between term 1 and term 2? I'd say so, right? Because if they both have x's, then technically we can take some of those x's out. However, if I gave you an equation that had an extra constant added, for example, 18, you would not be able to take an x out, right? Because all of your terms do not have an x. They all have to have an x in order to put an x outside of your bracket, okay? So we're going to look back at this, and we're going to go x times x times x and x times x. How many x's can we take out of the bracket then? We're looking for the greatest common that we can take out without causing issues. That would be 2, right? Because if I take 3 out, then what happens to this? We somehow have an x that doesn't exist. So that's not possible. So the most we can do is 2. Okay, so we're going to take out x times x. Well, what's another way of writing x times x? We can write it as x squared. So that is our greatest common factor. So it's going to be 8 and then times x to the power of 2. Okay? Now we need to figure out what's going on in our brackets. So if you remember, once you have determined what your greatest common factor is, you need to divide that out of term 1 and term 2, or all of your terms, depending on how many terms there are. Okay, so what we do is we write 8x to the power of 3, which is term number 1 up here, and then we're going to divide it by our greatest common factor that we determined, which is 8x to the power of 2. So the 8's cancel each other out. 8 divided by 8 is 1, so we're not going to worry about that. We can write the 1 if we'd like. We write the 1, okay. And what happens when we have x cubed divided by x squared? We could also, if we wanted to, we could write it like this. If that makes it easier, you could write it like this. Then you can do simple canceling out of division, right? You can cancel out these two, and then you could cancel these two because, you know, they cancel each other out. An x divided by x is equal to 1. An x divided by x is divided by 1. Then you end up with 1x on top. X divided by 1, which is just equal to x. So that means x cubed divided by x squared is going to be x. So we just determined that for term number 1, inside the bracket, we're going to have 1x, which I'm just going to write as x because that is the same thing. Okay? That's our first part. That is term number 1. Now let's look at term number 2. Remember, we have to pay attention to this little negative symbol when we do this one, okay? So we have negative 16x squared. So let's write that out and don't forget the negative symbol. We have 16x squared divided by what we decided to factor out, which is 8x squared, okay? divided by 8x squared. This is why the negative sign is very important, because now we're dividing our numbers. We have 16 divided by 8. But remember, that's negative 16. So negative 16 divided by 8 is going to be negative 2. So we have to pay attention to that. So negative 2. Because if we forgot about the negative sign, we're going to end up with flip-flop signs in our final equation, and then it will not work, okay? So now we have negative 2. Let's move on to our x values. So x squared divided by x squared. Let's take a look at that. We'll break it down once more. X times x is the same as x squared. And then we also have x times x on the bottom because that's x squared. So if we do simple canceling out, we go x divided by x and x divided by x. That all cancels out to equal 1 because there are no x's on top and there's no x's on the bottom. Therefore, it is 1. So we could multiply this whole thing by 1, but that really doesn't change anything. We're still going to end up with negative 2 right here, okay? So we've just determined our sign. We are going to subtract 2 in our bracket. There we go. So we've divided our stuff for term 1. We've divided by the greatest common factor for term 2. We've put it all into the brackets. Now we have this beautiful equation right here. This is 8x to the power of 2, bracket x minus 2, bracket closed. Okay? Now what we need to do with this beautiful equation right here is we need to determine what the x-intercepts are. Okay? So 8x squared minus, or bracket x minus 2. How do we determine what the x-intercepts are? First things first, if you notice that my original equation up here, I had it all set equal to 0. I didn't follow that through, but I will follow that through now. But that is always your first step to determine the x-intercepts. You need to have your whole equation equal to 0. Because what is always true about an x-intercept? Anywhere along this line, what is always true? It is always true that y is equal to 0. That is what an x-intercept is, okay? So we need to set our y equal to 0, which is exactly what we've done right there. Okay, so now we have it set. We need to determine what x values are going to solve this equation to get it to equal 0. Exactly. So whatever x values turn this whole thing equal to 0 are the x values that are the x-intercepts. So let's start with our inside here because that one is a little bit easier. Let's talk about it. If we have these two equations, not two equations, the multiplication of the factored and the greatest common factor there, they're multiplied together, right? What is true about multiplying anything by 0? X divided by 0 is equal to 0. 1 multiplied by 0 is equal to 0. Therefore, if you make this half equal to 0, the whole thing equals 0. And if you make this half equal to 0, then the whole thing equals 0. So let's sort out each individual part. That way we can figure out what the x-intercepts are. So let's start with our first little half here. Split it right there. What x value? So we can go 8x squared is equal to 0. What x value would make this entire thing equal to 0? 0 would be the only thing that would actually do that. Because if you have 8 times 0, you get 0. Right? And that would be the only one that would do that. So we're going to write x is equal to 0. Let's look at our other one over here. Now we have x minus 2. With x minus 2, what can we do to make it equal to 0? Well, let's just do our algebra to find out, right? Let's add our 2 to move over the 2. X is equal to positive 2. And there we have it. That is an x value that makes this whole thing equal to 0, which in turn makes that equal to 0. And this one right here turns this 0, which then turns the whole thing equal to 0. Therefore, we've just solved. And these are our final answers. So the x-intercepts are x equals 0 and 2. And that is how you use greatest common factoring with polynomials to determine your x-intercepts. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon.